Today's occurrence happens in Cleveland, Ohio, and is an event unlike anything I've ever heard before. A nonprofit aiming to set a world record by doing a harmless publicity stunt quickly learned that it wasn't as harmless as they believed, because after the awe of what they released passed, chaos and death followed. I'm Tatiana Bunch, and this is the story of Balloonfest 1986. United Way is an international network of almost 2,000 local nonprofit affiliates. Before 2015, it was the largest nonprofit organization in America by donations from the public. Each chapter of United Way does individual fundraising campaigns to raise money for different nonprofits. In 1986, the Cleveland chapter of United Way set their sights on raising money by breaking the world record for having the biggest balloon release. The director of marketing for United Way, Dr. George Frazier, got the idea from a centerfold of a magazine that had a photo for a huge balloon release at Disneyland. So George hunted down the guy who was behind that Disney spectacle and reached out to him. This wasn't something that could be thrown together at the last minute. Months of approvals, planning, and preparation would have to go into it. But George's search led him to a Los Angeles-based company named Balloon Art, ran by Treb Heining. George asked Treb if he could do something like what he did for Disney, but bigger. Now, in Balloon Art, there was a project manager, Tom Hallowack, who joined Treb's company about 2 years prior, but he had been doing special events logistics for almost a decade before that. Tom and Treb's first contract together was the 1984 Olympics opening and closing ceremonies. They had to design the logistics of filling hundreds of balloons to make up the Olympic rings, and then have cheerleaders move them to spell the word welcome, and then release the balloons. They had also worked together on Disneyland's 50th anniversary in 1985, where they had to find a way to blow up 1 million balloons, put them in bags of 1,000 each, and then carry them into the street. That was the event that caught George's eye. But before they could really hit the ground running, George had to take what him and Treb had roughly come up with together to the board for approval. George presented the board with the general idea and logistics of what they had in mind. The board, as George described it, was the creme de la creme of fundamentally white males. And when he finished his presentation, quote, "You could hear a rat piss on cotton in Georgia," end quote. Which just paints a vivid picture for me of what that room looked and felt like. But Jim Stover, the president of Eaton at the time, broke the silence. He thought it was a big idea, but it would be impossible. And George explained how he planned to involve young people from different races, white, black, and Hispanic, all parts of Cleveland, to bring them together for something huge. And Jim was sold. So when Tom and Treb officially received the contract for Balloonfest in Cleveland, they solidified details of the plan. They knew they wanted to release the balloons from a spot in front of Terminal Tower, and Tom had to develop a way to do that. Terminal Tower is a 52-story landmark skyscraper in the southwest quadrant of Cleveland's Public Square, which is the central plaza of downtown Cleveland. It's one of Cleveland's most familiar landmarks and its largest construction project of the 1920s. So Tom designed a city square block bin structure and redesigned it to meet building code in Cleveland for permanent structures, meaning it had to withstand up to 90 miles per hour winds, and the design had to be approved and certified by an engineer. He designed a rectangular structure 3 stories high and the size of a city block. It measured 250 feet by 150 feet, or 76 by 46 meters. Tom designed and ordered one huge net of mesh material that was supposed to hold all of the balloons in the bin until they were ready to be released. The net was made by a company in California who built cargo nets for the space shuttle, because the balloons would have about 25,000 pounds of lift, so something space shuttle strong was definitely needed. There were also going to be these huge 10-foot inflatable spheres tied to the outside of the net. They would release the inflatables, and then when they lifted up, they would lift the net too and free the balloons. Now, United Way's goal was to release 2 million balloons, and those balloons weren't going to blow themselves, so they asked student volunteers to help. Organizers had 6 weeks to find 2,500 students to help fill the balloons with helium. Kids in schools sold balloon sponsorships at 2 for $1, which is $2.88 today. All volunteers received a free t-shirt and bandaged fingers for their work. Literally, in footage of the event, you can see their fingers wrapped up from all the balloon tying. They had medical tape and bandages, the works. But the kids were organized into an assembly-style line operation, and they had to tie 3 balloons per minute. The event was sort of a redemption chance for Cleveland, because there had been a mass exodus in recent years. The 70s were filled with events that ultimately culminated in people wanting to get away in the 80s. Leading up to the launch, the nation's eyes were on Cleveland. It had a bad reputation and had been seen as a laughing stock and a so-called national embarrassment several times in recent years, to the point where even night show hosts would rag on this huge idea. There was a lot of pressure on organizers and everyone involved, because this would either be a chance for the city to redeem and reinvent itself, or to hopelessly crash and burn, not to mention the $500,000 that went into bringing the project to life. Organizers contacted the FAA to make sure that they had approval and the organization was on board to ensure not only commercial flights, but private planes wouldn't be at risk of flying into millions of balloons. Downtown was designated as NOTAM, which is pretty much a no-fly zone. With the government pretty much getting on board, companies like Coca-Cola, Kodak, Kmart, and more decided to help sponsor the event. Taco Bell used its publicity to ride the wave and have workers build the world's longest burrito. Even though the organizers planned to release 2 million balloons, they actually ended up settling on 1.5 million when it was all said and done. It was still more than Disneyland's anniversary by 500,000, and it made the world record. On the day of the launch, Saturday, September 27th, Tom, who kept in contact with 2 weather agencies at all times, because things up to this point weren't very smooth, I'll get back to that later, but at first the day was bright and sunny. An hour before their planned release, they were made aware that a storm from Canada could possibly go through downtown Cleveland. It wouldn't be a big storm, but if it was going to hit them, it would hit in about an hour. So organizers had to get together quickly and decide what they wanted to do. Treb figured they were done, so we might as well just launch early. And George was like, hey, you're in charge, whatever you decide, I'll help with. Those going to cut the thick rope holding the inflatables down were sent on one side of the net to cut it. But it was hard to get there because during the release, there were over 100,000 people gathered in downtown Cleveland to watch. So even the high schoolers were having a hard time being close to the thing that they helped create. I think it was George that described the balloon release as an atom bomb of joy in 50 different colors, and that you couldn't take your eyes off of it. And he's not wrong, because the way the balloons released into the sky looked like a huge, colorful mushroom cloud. And while they watched, people cheered and screamed and yelled, and you could just see how happy they were to watch something so amazing. And they watched the balloons until they disappeared. About 30 minutes after the launch, rain so light that it's the kind you don't even pull out a jacket or an umbrella for, came through and lasted at most 15 minutes. And then the sun came back out after. If anything, the weather change was annoying and not necessarily dangerous. It was a lovely fall day, or so they thought, because leading up to this point, a lot had happened and quite a bit happened after. At some point, word got out that the rain and cold front caused tens of thousands of balloons to fall to the ground and cover Lake Erie and part of Burke Lakefront Airport. Now, this was bad because the Coast Guard was still searching for 2 fishermen who went missing the night before. The night before the launch, the same incident made it so that the launch was almost canceled. Treb was staying at a hotel right by where the bin had been built, with the balloon sitting inside of it. And he just started hearing the wind. He looked out his window and he sees the inflatables popping off the bin one by one, and one corner of the net covering it being lifted and torn away. Tom, who was staying there too, looked out the window and saw a newspaper dispenser. Those heavy metal boxes that hold newspapers, and you can see the front page through the window before reaching in to grab a copy. Well, he sees that get lifted and spun around on one leg before being blown away. The wind damaged the netting tied to the bin to the point where the balloon release couldn't happen until they fixed it. There were holes all in it, so that same night, it's now around 10 p.m., and Treb calls a meeting with the balloon art crew. He pretty much tells them that the weather has always been on his side, and as devastating as it is, they've put, 6 months into this thing, but the luck might be out. They may need to cancel the launch. But Tom and the rest of balloon art tell Treb to go to sleep, they'll handle it. So they decided to pull an all-nighter to fix the tarp and the net and get things together for the launch in the morning. They fixed up the net, and word went out to high schoolers who volunteered. Buses went out to pick people up so they could come help fill the balloons. It was all hands on deck. By 3 a.m., everyone was arriving and hitting the ground running, trying to get everything back to the way it needed to be for the launch. They played music while they worked through the early hours of the morning. But as they filled the balloons and released them up into the net over the bin they were in, they realized they missed repairing a hole right in the center at the highest point. So once the net was filled to the point where it started to create a dome, balloons escaped. Tom tried to use a cherry picker. He had to patch up the hole, but it didn't get high enough. He remembered the fire chief gave him his number a while back though, and when he did, the guy told Tom that if he ever needed anything, to call him. So Tom took him at his word and gave the guy a call. The fire chief managed to get his tallest cherry picker 150 feet high to the location, and Tom taught a fireman basic net mending, and the fire chief and that fireman fixed the net. At the end of the day, this wasn't a serious matter. It wasn't life and death in that situation, and the fire chief didn't have to take it seriously at all. But he chose to, and it's ultimately why the balloon launch was able to happen. The wind gust that shredded the net was a microburst, between 60 and 90 miles per hour. Now, as the students are filling the balloons, the net that was just repaired started shifting unpredictably because they couldn't predict how it would move now that it had been ripped apart and put back together again. And since it was shifting unpredictably, it caught on scaffold bolts. Tom would go up and untangle the net off of the bolts, and the net would just get caught somewhere else. So Tom thought quickly and brought down some plastic trash cans and cut them into pieces and then used those pieces to cover enough bolts that would let the net move without getting caught. They were also able to replace the 10-foot inflatable spheres after making calls pretty early that morning to Chicago, where someone had them flown to Cleveland by 10 a.m. It wasn't enough to do both sides, but they had enough to lift one side. It wasn't until 2 p.m. that Tom went up to Treb and told him that he thought things were finally good to go. Shortly after that, they got a call about the weather, and not too long after the balloon launch, were those involved being sued for playing part in the death of those two boaters. Raymond Broderick and Bernard Sulzer were on Lake Erie the night before the balloon launch. After Raymond failed to return home the next morning, his wife reported him missing. His empty boat was found anchored near the Lake Erie break wall. The Coast Guard was just about to put a helicopter in the air to search for Raymond, but before they could, at least 1.5 million balloons were released in Public Square for United Way's annual fundraising campaign. According to Raymond's wife's lawyer, the balloon release happened without anyone considering weather conditions or if the Coast Guard had emergencies going on. Now, the Coast Guard still searched for Raymond and Bernard while the balloons were launched and fell, but the balloons made it impossible for them to see if anyone was in the lake. Raymond's remains were found a week later in the Cleveland harbor. According to many newspapers and reports, Raymond's wife believed United Way and Balloon Art were responsible for both men not being found in time. She was suing them for $3.2 million. During depositions, or right after, Balloon Art's lawyers got a hold of the autopsy report, and it revealed that the two boaters had died the night before. There was no way the men would have been able to survive in the water at that temperature for 12 to 14 hours. Treb obviously felt distraught at the thought of playing a part in someone not being saved, but ultimately, Balloonfest had nothing to do with what happened to Raymond and Bernard. The lawsuits were thrown out, but United Way was also sued by a woman saying that some of the balloons spooked her prize Arabian horses. Now, United Way had liability insurance. You don't throw an event like this without it, so insurance settled out of court with the woman for like $5,000. It actually turns out that the balloons themselves weren't what spooked the horses, but random people chasing after the balloon that spooked the horses. But that was the extent of the lawsuits. The insurance paid $5,000. Now, for years, it's been said that United Way and Balloon Art were sued for hundreds of thousands of dollars in damages for the boaters and the horses, and that the fundraiser lost money because of cost overruns. And that just wasn't the case. Later, a search and rescue program manager for the Coast Guard came forward to say that they never would have stopped a search over balloons. They may have held the helicopter until it was safe to get in the air, but they would have kept boats in the water. And they did. Now, the water was 66 degrees Fahrenheit, the wind was at least 60 miles per hour, plus swells and no life jacket. Their functional time, which is roughly the amount of time a person can keep themselves afloat without a life jacket, was 10 hours. It's believed Bernard was able to hang on until 7 a.m. and Raymond until 10 a.m. There were also rumors that there was chaos and injuries following the balloons falling back down and millions of dollars in damages. And that also wasn't the case. Now, there was traffic from people still trying to make it into downtown Cleveland to watch the balloon launch, and then people being distracted watching the balloons after they were launched. There was also a multi-car crash from people being distracted and staring at the balloons instead of the road, but that can hardly be placed on organizers because you're supposed to be keeping your eyes on the road when you're driving, not staring at balloons. Rumors about the balloons polluting the environment and waterways also came about, but that simply wasn't the case because the organizers used biodegradable balloons. And while those aren't perfect, these ones were specifically formulated to degrade within 6 months to a year, depending on weather conditions. There was one report of a guy saying that he saw thousands of balloon fragments on the lakeshore on Canada's side, but after he got a photographer to go back there with him to document the evidence, it was all gone. It had either been degraded or buried, but either way, it was a non-issue, which actually relieved the guy who made the report. United Way held on to the world record for the biggest balloon release for almost 10 years until Disney broke their record in England with 1.7 million balloons in 1994. It was during the launch of Aladdin, the animated version. Now, if you have heard of Balloonfest before this episode, and that it was this huge tragedy where people died and companies were sued into the ground, where did it start? Where did the misinformation begin? Because after it happened, yes, there were reports that there were lawsuits going on, but that was kind of the end of it until 2011, considering they were dismissed. Well, according to Treb, Michael O'Malley, a reporter for The Plain Dealer, wrote an article that was full of a lot of the misinformation I just touched on. And when Treb found this article, he contacted the reporter who was asking Treb for proof that what he wrote wasn't true. Like, he said that the world record at Balloonfest was actually stripped by Guinness World Records. And Treb was like, no, it wasn't. I have the book right here with our record in it. And then the reporter asked if he could forward a picture of it to him. And that's pretty much how that conversation went, with Treb pointing out what the reporter got wrong and the writer asking for proof that he was wrong. He even interviewed a woman named Mandy Basil, who helped out with Balloonfest 25 years prior when she was in high school. And when she saw the article, she was very confused because everything she told the reporter was positive. She didn't expect the negative tone of the article because in her mind, it was all positive. It was a phone interview, but she wasn't negative at all. And I won't read the whole section because you kind of have to read the whole thing to get the full picture. But the vibe of her part in the article was that she pretty much didn't remember much about it. Like, she remembered how all the high schoolers were told that they would end up in the world record books and be widely known, and how she couldn't remember if anything actually came of it, but she did remember waking up really early in the morning and not making it home until late at night. How she didn't even bother mentioning it in her diary or even going back to watch the launch the next day. But the way everything is framed made it seem like those organizing the event tricked the students into working until their fingers bled for a fake record, because they never made it into the Guinness Book of Records. Like, there's one part where she says, "Maybe I was too busy nursing my sore fingers." And what I can only take is a joking way to excuse the fact that she put in all that work and then missed the launch. But in my opinion, the way the article is written makes it seem as though the students were worked until they were in pain for a false goal. And in her case, the pain was so much that she couldn't bring herself to go watch the launch the next day. I wouldn't call it malicious, but it was kind of a sleazy angle for that article to take. Now, the twist is that the editor for that article in 2011 is also the editor of the newspaper that did a mini fact-checking documentary on this event. His name is Curtis Quinn, and he did admit to his part in that article being approved, that it fell on him not doing his due diligence, and therefore led to a snowball effect of that being published and then other publications not doing their own due diligence and making things worse. This led to more than a couple of YouTube videos, each one more dramatic than the next, about the events and claiming crazy things like emergency services were overrun with calls from people being harmed by balloons falling from the sky. I will link to that documentary in the source material for this episode, which you can find the link to it in the show notes. But Chris Quinn felt that he had a part in starting that snowball effect, and it was now his duty to correct that misinformation with the publication he's currently with, which is cleveland.com. If you look up this story now, just on Google, you will see so much misinformation, even on Wikipedia, which I know is not like the epitome of accurate information, but they do a pretty decent job, for the most part, of at least flagging what they're unsure of or know to be wrong. But even the Wikipedia page for this event has some of that misinformation up as of my recording of this episode. So hopefully, it will soon be corrected. And even though it has its flaws, Wikipedia is still an important resource for many worldwide, so I urge you, the next time you see them begging on their hands and knees for donations, please donate. This is not sponsored. That is just my 2 cents. Free information is important. Let's work to keep it accurate. Now, over $47 million was raised by the campaign, which is almost $136 million today, but you won't catch mass balloon releases being approved in most places anymore. Many cities won't allow it, including Cleveland. Today, we know the fragments can cause issues or kill wildlife, like birds and fish. But this event wasn't a disaster by any means. In fact, for years after it happened, it was portrayed positively. It was a happy memory for Clevelanders then, and looking back, it still is now. Stay safe, and I'll be back next Thursday. All sources can be found at occurrencepod.com, which is linked in the show notes, along with any other relevant information.